My daughter did not forget to pick me up after surgery. She left me there on purpose, drove to the far end of the clinic parking lot, and waited to see whether $26 and a blurred pair of eyes would finally make me sign over my house. I learned that from a white-haired woman leaning on a brass-handled cane who sat down beside me, looked through the glass doors, and said, "Pretend you're my elevator inspector. Stephanie is still outside, and she thinks you're about to surrender." I was 67 years old. My pupils were still wide from laser treatment, and until that moment I had believed cruelty usually announced itself with shouting. I was wrong. Sometimes it spoke gently, called you Dad, and promised to be back in 20 minutes. My name is Harold Bennett, and I had spent 42 years repairing elevators across northern Ohio. I could identify a worn bearing by sound, straighten a misaligned door track by touch, and calm a trapped passenger before the fire department arrived. But that January afternoon, I could not read the numbers on my phone. The clinic had removed the protective shield from my left eye, taped a dark cover over the right, and warned me not to drive until the next morning. Stephanie had insisted she would take me home. She arrived before the procedure wearing the expensive camel-colored coat I had bought her 2 Christmases earlier and carrying a leather folder. While we waited, she opened it and showed me a quitclaim deed, transferring my small brick house in Parma into her name. "It's just planning ahead," she said. "You're alone there, Dad. Grant and I can manage the taxes, repairs, everything." I told her the house was paid off, the furnace was new, and I was not dead. Her mouth tightened. "Nobody said you were dead." "Then stop handing me papers that act like I am." She closed the folder so hard the receptionist looked up. During the drive to the clinic, she barely spoke. After surgery, the nurse walked me to the discharge area and asked Stephanie to bring the car around. My daughter kissed my cheek and said, "I'll be right outside." 20 minutes passed, then 40. I called her 3 times, but every attempt went to voicemail. When the nurse checked the system, she frowned and told me Stephanie had phoned the front desk, claiming I had arranged another ride. I had arranged nothing. My wallet held a 10, 3 fives, and a single-dollar bill. My phone showed 2% battery. Home was 27 miles away, and the January rain had begun freezing against the windows. At first, I made excuses for her. Maybe Grant had been hurt. Maybe the car would not start. Maybe she had misunderstood the discharge time. Pride can make an old man defend the very person humiliating him, because admitting the truth means admitting that love did not protect you from being used. The waiting room emptied around me. A janitor rolled up a rug near the entrance. The nurse asked twice whether there was anyone else she could call, and twice I said no. Then the white-haired woman approached. She wore a navy wool suit, low black shoes, and the kind of expression that made younger people straighten their backs. "Your daughter wanted you to sign something," she said. My head turned toward her voice. "Were you listening?" I was sitting 6 feet away. At my age, that qualifies as being in the same conversation. She introduced herself as Ruth Calder. I told her my name, and she asked what Stephanie drove. "A silver Lexus," I said. Ruth leaned toward the window and pointed with her cane. "3rd row, near the pharmacy sign." Through the blur, I could make out the pale shape of a car and someone behind the wheel. "How long has it been there?" I asked. "At least 30 minutes. My stomach went cold. "You're sure?" She got out once, made a phone call, then went back inside. "She has checked these doors 7 times. I stood too quickly and nearly lost my balance. Ruth caught my arm with surprising strength. "Easy." I stared toward the parking lot. Stephanie had not abandoned me because she was careless. She was waiting for me to call, frightened and helpless, so she could return with the deed and make rescue conditional. Ruth followed my gaze and said, "Whatever lesson your daughter intends to teach you, you are not required to cooperate." Headlights swept beneath the clinic awning. A dark blue Lincoln stopped outside, and a broad-shouldered woman in a chauffeur's coat stepped out with an umbrella. Ruth adjusted her gloves. "My car is here." I thanked her for telling me what she had seen, but I said I would find another ride. "With $26, 1 functioning eye, and freezing rain?" she asked. "I'll manage." "I'm sure you will. The question is whether you must manage alone." Then she lowered her voice. "Walk out with me and pretend you are inspecting one of my elevators. Your daughter does not need to know where you are going. She only needs to see that helplessness was not your only option. The request sounded ridiculous, but so did the truth sitting in that parking lot. Ruth took my elbow, raised her voice, and said, "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate you coming on such short notice. The residents have complained for weeks. I understood immediately. A delayed door can be more dangerous than a stopped car," I replied, falling into the language of my old trade. "I'll need to hear the machine under load." We walked through the sliding doors like two people with business to conduct. The driver opened the Lincoln's rear door. Just before I climbed in, I turned toward the silver Lexus. Stephanie was staring at us. Even through my blurred vision, I recognized the shock in the way she leaned forward. My phone began vibrating before Ruth's driver pulled away. I did not answer. For once, my daughter could sit and wonder who had come for me. Ruth did not take me to a mansion. She took me to Calder House, a 6-story senior residence built from an old hotel overlooking Lake Erie. The lobby had polished terrazzo floors, winter flowers arranged in blue ceramic pots, and 3 elevators set behind brass doors. The place looked expensive without feeling cold. But the moment we entered, I heard something wrong. The center elevator arrived with a faint metallic scrape, followed by a hollow knock above the ceiling. Ruth was speaking to the front desk manager when I raised one hand. "Don't send that car back up," the manager blinked. "Excuse me?" I moved closer to the doors and listened as they began closing. "Stop it." He reached for the control panel. The doors reopened. Ruth studied my face. "What did you hear? A roller dragging or a hanger loosening?" "Maybe both." "How long has it been doing that?" The manager said maintenance had inspected it the previous week. They called it cosmetic. Metal striking metal in a door assembly is never cosmetic. I asked whether the elevator company had left a report. The manager looked embarrassed and said it was in his office. Ruth told him to retrieve it. While he was gone, an elderly couple approached, pushing a grocery cart. I blocked the center elevator and directed them to the one on the left. The husband muttered that the noisy car had trapped his wife between floors for 9 minutes 3 days earlier. Nobody had reported that incident to Ruth. Her expression hardened. The manager returned with a single-page invoice, claiming the equipment was safe, and the noise came from normal, seasonal expansion. I had heard plenty of bad excuses in 4 decades, but that was a new one. I asked Ruth's permission to look more closely. "You just left eye surgery," she said. "I can listen without climbing." We rode the adjacent elevator to the 6th floor, where a service corridor led to the machine space. I stood outside the locked door while the building engineer operated the center car below. Each time it passed the 5th floor, the scrape deepened. "Take it out of service," I said. "Tonight." The engineer protested that residents would complain. "They will complain louder if a door hanger fails while someone is entering." Ruth did not debate me. She ordered the car shut down and called an independent contractor. 2 hours later, the contractor found a fractured bracket and a worn roller assembly. Another week of use could have allowed the outer door to shift far enough to strike a passenger. The engineer went pale when he heard that. Ruth simply looked at me and said, "You earned dinner." By then my sight had improved enough to read Stephanie's messages. There were 17. The first said, "Where are you?" The 4th said, "Who was that woman?" The 9th said, "I was only trying to help you." The last said, "We need to discuss the house before this gets out of control." Ruth noticed me turning the phone face down. "She waited until you found transportation before she became worried," she said. "That tells you what she feared losing." I asked why Ruth had been at the clinic. She told me she had accompanied one of her residents, a 90-year-old former librarian whose family lived out of state. Ruth could have sent an employee, but the woman had been nervous, so she went herself. "You own this place?" I asked. "I own 11 places like it, though I'm beginning to suspect ownership and knowledge have drifted too far apart." Her husband had started Calder Senior Living 37 years earlier, after Ruth's mother broke a hip in an unsafe apartment building. They built residences designed around dignity rather than storage. After her husband died, Ruth continued expanding, but recent growth had brought layers of managers, vendors, and reports that made every problem sound smaller by the time it reached her desk. The elevator incident was not the first complaint she had discovered only by accident. "Why did you help me?" I asked. She stirred her soup before answering. Her older brother had died 5 years earlier after his adult son persuaded him to transfer his home, then moved him into a facility he had never chosen. Ruth had fought with the family, but the paperwork had already been signed. He kept saying he did not want to be a burden, she told me. People had repeated that phrase until he mistook surrender for kindness. She looked directly at me. When I heard your daughter discussing a deed, I recognized the choreography. I expected Ruth's driver to take me home after dinner, but the freezing rain had turned to sleet, and she offered me a vacant guest suite for the night. The next morning, she placed a thin folder beside my coffee. It did not contain my entire life story or an impossible offer to run her company. It contained 3 recent safety complaints from 3 different Calder properties, each closed by the same maintenance vendor without meaningful repair. I am hiring a licensed engineering firm to perform a full review, she said. But engineers often see machines. You spent 42 years seeing the people inside them. She proposed a 90-day consulting contract. I would visit all 11 residences, interview residents and maintenance staff, review elevator and accessibility complaints, and report directly to her. The pay was fair but not extravagant. There was no promise of partnership, inheritance, or title. Why me? I asked. Because yesterday you were frightened, half-blind, and furious with your daughter, yet the first thing you did in this building was stop 2 strangers from entering a dangerous elevator. I told her I would accept under 3 conditions. I would not be used as decoration, I would be free to report failures even when they embarrassed her executives, and my contract would end if my work was not useful. Ruth smiled. Mr. Bennett, the people who worry me are the ones who negotiate only for money. I signed. That afternoon, her driver took me home. Stephanie's Lexus was parked in my driveway, and she stood beneath the porch light holding the leather folder. I stepped out of the Lincoln, thanked the driver, and walked past my daughter. She followed me inside, demanding to know where I had been. Working, I said. At your age? Especially at my age. She placed the deed on my kitchen table. Dad, none of this changes the practical situation. I picked up the folder, opened the back door, and dropped it into the recycling bin. The practical situation is that you left a half-blind man at a clinic to force his signature. Her face reddened. I was trying to make you understand that you can't keep living like nothing will change. Something changed today. What? I looked at her and said, you no longer have a key to this house. Then I held out my hand. After a long silence, Stephanie removed the spare key from her ring and placed it in my palm. The first 90 days with Calder Senior Living were harder than anything I had done since retiring. Ruth gave me a small office, a laptop I did not know how to use properly, and a schedule that began at 7 each morning. I visited buildings in Cleveland, Akron, Toledo, and smaller towns where winter winds seemed to cut through brick. I rode every elevator at different hours, watched how residents moved during meals, inspected emergency phones, interviewed aides, and sat with maintenance workers who were more honest after their supervisors left. The pattern appeared quickly. Calder's executives had outsourced nearly all mechanical service to Northline Facilities, a company owned by the brother-in-law of the chief operations officer. Northline's invoices were detailed, expensive, and often false. Work orders listed parts that had never been installed. Emergency calls were reclassified as comfort complaints. One building reported that a resident's wheelchair had been caught by closing doors, yet the corporate record said she had misjudged entry timing. I found her in apartment 412. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, and she showed me a purple scar on her forearm. They told me I moved too slowly, she said. I'm 86. Moving slowly is not misconduct. That sentence changed the tone of my report. I stopped treating the audit like a collection of mechanical failures and began documenting the way language was being used to blame residents for hazards created by management. Ruth read every page. She did not defend her executives. She asked who knew, how long they had known, and what could be fixed first. By the end of the second month, she had suspended the operations chief, terminated Northline's contract, and ordered independent inspections across the company. I trained building staff to recognize early warning sounds and created a simple reporting system that allowed residents or aides to send complaints directly to a central safety office. Younger managers initially treated me like an old mechanic who had wandered into corporate headquarters. but their attitude shifted after my inspection prevented a brake failure at a Toledo property. The elevator had passed its scheduled review only 6 weeks earlier. I found heat discoloration around the machine and insisted it be shut down. The contractor Lebedosh admitted the brake lining had been installed incorrectly. No one was hurt because we caught it in time. Ruth offered to extend my contract for a year and asked me to build a permanent resident safety department. I accepted, but I rented a small apartment near Calder House instead of moving into any property she owned. I wanted my work and friendship with Ruth to remain separate from Charity. Stephanie called during those months, usually after seeing my name in local business articles about Calder's safety reforms. Her tone changed from anger to concern. She asked whether Ruth paid me, whether I had signed long-term agreements, and whether I had changed my will. I answered the first question once and refused the rest. "I'm your daughter," she said. "You are," I replied. "That is a relationship, not a search warrant." She accused Ruth of turning me against the family. "No," I said. "Being left at the clinic did that. Ruth simply drove me away from it. Then Grant came to see me." My son-in-law had always spoken as though every sentence were part of a sales presentation. He arrived carrying coffee and said he wanted to clear the air. We sat in my living room, where he admired the new locks without mentioning why I had installed them. For 20 minutes he talked about family unity, Stephanie's stress, and the importance of planning. Then he said their mortgage company had called in a business loan connected to his failed restaurant venture. They needed $90,000 within 3 weeks. "We are not asking for a gift," he said. "You could take out a home equity line, and we would make the payments." I asked how many payments they had made on the $5,000 I lent them 2 years earlier. He stared at his coffee. "That was different. It always is." Grant leaned forward. "You have a paid-off house and a good new job. Ruth Calder is clearly taking care of you. Ruth pays me for work. You know what I mean." "I do, and that is why the answer is no." His pleasant expression vanished. He said, "I was choosing a stranger over my daughter." I reminded him that the stranger had not left me after surgery. Grant stood and paced toward the window. "Stephanie thought you would call her from the clinic. She never meant for you to be stranded. She lied to the nurse. Because you were being stubborn. She waited outside." He turned quickly. "You don't know that." I studied him. I had never told Grant that Ruth had seen Stephanie's car. His denial revealed more than an admission would have. "You knew," I said. He stopped moving. "Stephanie called me. She was upset. Did you tell her to leave me there?" He would not answer. Instead, he said, "You are not thinking clearly anymore." The sentence was quiet, almost casual, but it carried a threat. I opened the front door and told him to leave. As he stepped onto the porch, he looked back and said, "Someone needs to protect you from making decisions you'll regret." 3 weeks later, a county deputy handed me a petition seeking emergency guardianship over my person and property. Stephanie claimed I had suffered cognitive decline, become vulnerable after surgery, withdrawn from family, and fallen under the influence of a wealthy business owner who had placed me in a position beyond my qualifications. She requested temporary control over my bank accounts and authority to manage my house until the court could determine whether I was competent. Attached to the petition was Grant's sworn statement describing my refusal to borrow against my home as irrational financial behavior. The daughter who had failed to get my signature at a clinic was now asking a judge to sign for me. The petition frightened me more than I wanted Ruth to know. Machines fail according to physical rules. Families can manufacture concern from pieces of truth. I was 67. I had undergone eye surgery. I had changed jobs unexpectedly, reduced contact with my daughter, and accepted work from a wealthy woman I had met on the day of my abandonment. On paper, stripped of motive and sequence, my new life could be made to sound suspicious. Ruth hired no army of celebrity attorneys. She introduced me to Marisol Kent, a probate lawyer who had spent 25 years defending older adults from unnecessary guardianships. Marisol listened without interrupting as I described the deed, the clinic, Grant's loan request, and the petition. Then she asked the question that made me ashamed. "Do you have proof that Stephanie intended to condition your ride on signing the house over?" I did not. Stephanie had spoken mostly in person. My phone contained messages sent after I had left with Ruth, but nothing explicit. Marisol told me not to invent certainty where evidence was missing. We will not win by calling her evil, she said. We will win by showing that you understand your choices and that her request for control serves her interests more than your safety. I underwent an independent neuropsychological evaluation that lasted nearly 4 hours. The doctor tested memory, reasoning, attention, financial judgment, and decision-making. I left exhausted and angry that I had to prove my mind belonged to me, but the report found no cognitive impairment. Marisol also gathered my work records, tax returns, bank statements, consulting contract, and the safety reports I had produced. Ruth offered to testify, though she warned me that Stephanie's lawyer would portray her as the powerful stranger who benefited from separating a father and daughter. They may ask why I hired you so quickly, she said. Then tell them the truth. The truth is that I took a chance, a paid 90-day chance with no access to your assets. Ruth nodded. Details are less dramatic than accusations. That is why they matter. The strongest evidence arrived from a place none of us expected. The clinic's administrator called after receiving a subpoena for discharge records. Along with the nurse's note stating that Stephanie had claimed another driver was coming, the clinic preserved a voicemail from Stephanie made 37 minutes after she left the waiting area. Her voice said, "My father is refusing a necessary family arrangement. He may call and say I abandoned him, but he has transportation options and needs time to reconsider." She had not stated that she would return if I signed, but she had documented that her departure was connected to the property dispute. Then my neighbor, Mr. Callahan, brought me a security camera recording from his doorbell. Stephanie and Grant had visited my house 2 days before the clinic and photographed the exterior while speaking with a real estate agent. The agent testified that Stephanie had asked about listing the property after a family transfer expected later that week. They had begun planning the sale before I signed anything. Finally, Ruth's company produced my employment timeline, showing I had received no company stock, no ownership interest, and no authority over Ruth's personal finances. My salary was comparable to similar safety positions, and every promotion followed documented results. The story Stephanie told depended on the idea that I had been swept into wealth. The record showed something less glamorous and more convincing. I had gone back to work. The hearing took place on a gray Monday morning in a courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and wet wool. Stephanie sat across the aisle wearing the same camel coat she had worn to the clinic. Grant sat behind her, whispering to their attorney. I kept looking at my daughter's hands. When she was 6, those hands had clung to my work shirt whenever thunder shook the windows. When she was 16, I taught those hands to change a flat tire. Now they rested on a petition, asking the state to remove my authority over my own life. Her lawyer began carefully. He did not call me senile. He described me as a proud older man who had experienced surgery, loneliness, and emotional shock before entering a relationship with a powerful stranger. He argued that vulnerability could exist without dementia. That part was true, which made the accusation dangerous. Stephanie testified that she had wanted only to simplify my affairs. She said I became hostile after meeting Ruth, replaced my locks, concealed my work, and refused reasonable financial planning. When asked about the clinic, she claimed she had stepped away because our argument made driving unsafe. Did you remain in the parking lot? Marisol asked. Stephanie hesitated. For a while. Why? I hoped he would calm down. Did you tell the nurse another ride was coming? I believed he could arrange one. With impaired vision, my father is resourceful. Marisol played the clinic voicemail. Stephanie's own words filled the room. Family arrangement, refusing, time to reconsider. Then Marisol displayed the unsigned quitclaim deed and the real estate agent's notes dated before my surgery. You were preparing to sell his house before he agreed to transfer it, correct? Stephanie said they were only exploring possibilities. Possibilities involving property you did not own? Marisol asked. Grant testified next. He described my refusal to obtain a home equity loan as evidence I no longer understood family obligations. Marisol asked whether he personally owed money from a failed business. He admitted that he did. She asked whether the requested loan would have used my home as collateral. He admitted that too. Then she asked, If Mr. Bennett were declared incapacitated and your wife appointed guardian, would she gain authority to borrow against the property? Grant's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the question. Grant said he did not know. The judge looked at him for several long seconds. You signed a sworn statement about Mr. Bennett's finances, yet you did not investigate what authority your wife sought. Grant had no useful answer. Ruth testified for nearly an hour. She explained the elevator failure, my temporary contract, the independent inspections, and the sequence of my promotions. Stephanie's lawyer asked whether Ruth had become emotionally attached to me. Yes, Ruth said. Friendship is not evidence of coercion. He asked whether she had discussed inheritance with me. Never. He asked whether she planned to leave me, company ownership. No. He seemed disappointed. The story worked better if hidden millions waited at the end. Then I took the stand. Marisol asked me to explain my monthly income, expenses, insurance, savings, mortgage status, and employment terms. I answered without notes. She asked why I had refused Stephanie's deed. Because planning for old age does not require giving away control before I choose to. She asked why I had changed the locks. Because someone who abandons you to force a signature should not have unrestricted access to your home. Finally, Stephanie's lawyer stood and asked whether I still loved my daughter. Yes. He asked whether refusing her help could be emotional punishment. Some of it may feel like punishment to her, I said, because she was accustomed to access without permission. He asked whether Ruth had influenced that belief. Experience influenced it. He stepped closer. Mr. Bennett, is it possible you are overreacting to one painful afternoon? I looked at Stephanie. The afternoon was painful. The guardianship petition is a pattern. The judge issued her decision after a short recess. She found no basis for guardianship, no evidence that I lacked capacity, and substantial reason to believe the petition was entangled with a property dispute and the petitioner's financial interests. She dismissed the case and ordered Stephanie to pay a portion of my legal fees. Then she looked directly at my daughter and said, "Concern for an aging parent does not create ownership of that parent." Stephanie lowered her head. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired, relieved, and older than I had that morning. Winning back rights that should never have been challenged does not feel like victory. It feels like surviving a robbery committed in the language of love. Stephanie waited for me outside the courthouse after Grant left without saying goodbye. Snow had begun falling in thin, dry flakes, and traffic moved slowly along Ontario Street. Ruth and Marisol walked ahead to give us privacy. My daughter stood with both hands in her coat pockets and said, "I never thought the judge would believe I wanted your house. You did want it. I wanted to protect it. By selling it." Her eyes filled, but I did not rush to comfort her. For most of my life, the sight of Stephanie crying could erase my anger before she changed her behavior. That habit had helped bring us here. She said Grant had convinced her that my house could solve their debts, and that transferring it would eventually benefit everyone. "He said you would live with us," she added. "Did you ask whether I wanted to?" She shook her head. "Did you plan a room for me?" Another shake. "Did you calculate how long the sale money would last after his creditors were paid?" She whispered, "No." I told her that love could survive wrongdoing, but trust could not survive denial. If she wanted a relationship with me, she would have to rebuild it under clear conditions. She would not receive a key, financial authority, information about my will, or access to Ruth's business. She would never again present documents during a medical appointment or treat transportation, care, or affection as leverage. She could call me once a week. We could meet for coffee in public. If Grant attended, I would leave. Stephanie looked toward the courthouse doors. "He's my husband." "Then you decide what that means for you." "I have decided what it means for me." She asked whether I would ever forgive her. "Forgiveness is not a switch," I said. "It is what may grow after truth stops being negotiated." We did not hug. She walked to her car alone. Grant sent me several angry messages over the next month, accusing Ruth of destroying his family. I blocked his number. Stephanie kept to the arrangement. Her first calls were awkward and full of silence. She asked about my eye, then my work. Twice she started to ask about money and stopped herself. 3 months later, she told me she had separated from Grant after discovering he had hidden additional debts. I did not congratulate her or invite her home. I said I was sorry she was hurting and reminded her that I could listen without rescuing. That distinction was difficult for both of us. Over the next year, she found an apartment, took a bookkeeping job, and began repaying the $5,000 I had lent them. The payments were small, but they arrived without reminders. We shared Thanksgiving lunch at a diner because neither of us was ready for my kitchen. It was not the restoration of our old relationship. That old relationship had included too much dependence and too little honesty. We were attempting to build a different one. 18 months after Ruth sat beside me at the clinic, Calder Senior Living created a permanent office of resident safety, and I became its director. I did not receive company shares, a mansion, or a miraculous fortune. I received a modest salary, a team of 6 inspectors, and the authority to stop work when residents were at risk. That meant more to me than an inheritance. We replaced dozens of unsafe door systems, rewrote emergency procedures, and created resident councils at every property. Mrs. Alvarez, whose arm had been injured, became the first chair of the council at Calder House. She attended our annual meeting wearing a red hat and told the executives, "If you want to know whether a building works, ask the people who move slowly through it." Ruth laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. Later she told me she was stepping back from daily operations but not disappearing. "You are not taking over my company," she warned. "I have competent people for that." "That is a relief," I said. "I still hate quarterly forecasts." She tapped my shoe with her cane. "You are protecting the reason the company exists. That is harder to replace." Stephanie and I continued meeting carefully. She eventually apologized without mentioning grant, stress, or good intentions. She said, "I left you there because I wanted you frightened enough to need me." It was the ugliest and most honest sentence she had ever given me. I told her hearing the truth hurt, but excuses had hurt longer. We did not pretend the damage was gone. We learned that reconciliation is not returning to the moment before betrayal. It is deciding whether two changed people can create something safer afterward. One cold afternoon, I returned to the same eye clinic for my annual exam. My vision was clear, and I could have left as soon as the doctor finished. But while I waited for my ride, I noticed an older woman sitting near the window, with a plastic discharge bag on her lap. She checked her phone, sighed, and looked toward the parking lot every time a car stopped beneath the awning. After 40 minutes, the receptionist approached and asked whether her nephew was coming. The woman forced a smile and said, "He's busy. I'm sure he'll be here." I recognized the sentence because I had once built similar excuses for Stephanie. I sat 2 chairs away and introduced myself. Her name was Lorraine. She had undergone a procedure on her shoulder, and her nephew had promised to drive her home. We talked about Cleveland winters, terrible hospital coffee, and the strange confidence doctors have when telling patients not to lift anything for 6 weeks. Her phone finally rang. She listened for a few seconds, said, "I understand," and ended the call. She did not cry. She simply became smaller in the chair. "He isn't coming," she said. I asked where she lived. It was 12 miles away. I arranged a car through Calder's transportation service and told the driver to wait until Lorraine was safely inside her apartment. She protested that she could not accept charity from a stranger. "It isn't charity," I said. "It's a ride." Then I stayed beside her until the car arrived. I did not tell her about Stephanie, the deed, Ruth, the guardianship case, or the elevators. She did not need a lesson from me. She needed someone to remain in the chair beside hers while she understood that the person she trusted was not coming. As the car pulled away, I looked toward the 3rd row of the parking lot where Stephanie's Lexus had once waited for me to surrender. For years I had believed getting older meant becoming less visible, less necessary, and easier for the people I loved to manage. Ruth had shown me something different. She did not save me by placing me near wealth. She saved me by recognizing that my experience still had use, my choices still belonged to me, and humiliation did not have to become my final identity. My daughter's abandonment ended one version of my life, the version in which love meant endless access and helping meant surrendering whatever someone demanded. What followed was not revenge. It was work, boundaries, purpose, and the slow discovery that dignity can return one decision at a time. I entered that clinic with $26, damaged vision, and a daughter waiting outside for me to give up my home. I left beside a stranger who asked me to pretend I was an inspector. The strange part, my friends, was that she had seen the truth before I had. I had spent my whole life inspecting machines for signs of failure, but I had ignored the warning sounds inside my own family. Once I finally listened, I did not lose everything. I found the work I was still meant to do, the people who valued what I could give without demanding what I owned, and the courage to sit beside someone else when their own ride never came.